By the early 1900s, 1 out of every 150 loggers working the forests of Washington state died on the job every single year. That's not a bad decade, that's a bad Tuesday, repeated for 30 years straight, until roughly 1/3 of the 18-year-olds who picked up an axe in a Pacific Northwest logging camp would never live to see 65. This is a week in the life of one of those men. Here's the job. Pacific Northwest logging, roughly 1900 to 1920. The era of hand tools, steam power, and trees so large a single one could fill a boxcar. Most people picture this work as rugged but honest: flannel, an axe, a beard, a postcard version of frontier grit, the kind of thing Paul Bunyan turned into folklore. But the real numbers say something else. Loggers in Washington were dying at a rate higher than soldiers in some wartime deployments, and the industry that employed them fought, sometimes literally with rifles, against the most basic safety and pay reforms for over a decade. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what a single week looked like for these men, from the 4 in the morning wake-up bell to the moment armed strikebreakers opened fire on a boatload of them in 1916. This comes from historian Andrew Mason Prouty's Labor Fatality Research, Bureau of Labor Statistics Historical Data, and the archives of the Washington State Historical Society. Day 1. The bell nobody wanted to hear. The day started before the sun did. Camp cooks were often up by 3:30 in the morning to have breakfast ready, and a triangle or horn rang out while it was still dark to pull men out of bunks stacked in crowded, poorly ventilated shanties that smelled like wet wool, kerosene, and unwashed bodies packed 12 to a room. Breakfast had to be enormous, because a faller could burn upward of 8,000 to 9,000 calories swinging an axe and dragging a crosscut saw through old growth for 10 hours. But camp rules in many outfits banned talking during meals entirely. So 300 exhausted men would eat in total silence, shoveling down beans, biscuits, and salt pork before marching out into forest still dark enough to need lanterns. Therefore, the workday hadn't even begun, and these men had already been standing, dressed, and fed inside conditions most people today would call unlivable. Day 2. The undercut. This is where the second most surprising part of the job shows up. Fallers didn't just walk up to a tree and start swinging. Douglas firs at the base can be 16 feet across and soaked in sap. So 2 men would jam wooden planks called springboards into notches chopped directly into the trunk, sometimes 8 or 10 feet off the ground, and stand on those narrow boards, no harness, no net, to get above the widest part of the tree. From up there, they sawed 1/3 of the way through with a long, flexible 2-man crosscut saw, nicknamed the Misery Whip, then switched to axes to chop out a wedge called the Undercut, sighting down the axe handle like a rifle to aim exactly where several tons of 200-foot tree would fall. But a single miscalculation, a gust of wind, a hidden rot pocket, a saw that bound at the wrong moment could send that trunk in a direction no one predicted, crushing men who had nowhere to run because they were still balanced on a plank 10 feet in the air. Therefore, even the most routine cut of the day was closer to a controlled demolition than chopping wood, and it's why loggers rarely called it anything as casual as that. Day 3. The man who climbed into the sky. Here's the detail almost nobody outside the industry knows. Once a tree was felled, camps still needed a spar tree, a single standing giant sometimes topping 200 feet, rigged with cables and pulleys to haul logs out of the woods. Somebody had to climb it first. That job belonged to the high climber or high rigger, who strapped iron spikes to his boots, looped a rope around the trunk, and walked straight up the bark, trimming branches with a hand axe as he went 200 feet above the ground, with nothing below him but stumps. Near the top, where the diameter narrowed to 3 or 4 feet, he would cut the crown off entirely, sometimes with dynamite on a slow fuse, and brace himself against the recoil as the top of the tree snapped away and the trunk beneath him whipped back and forth in an arc. Loose limbs and treetops, left hanging in the canopy from earlier falls, picked up a nickname during this era that is still used by loggers today: the Widowmaker, because a single one coming loose could make a wife a widow in half a second. But climbers did not get hazard pay for this, they got a reputation. and camps competed for the fastest rigger the way modern crews might brag about a star player. Therefore, the most dangerous job in the entire operation was also treated as a point of pride rather than a warning sign. Day 4. The rules of the bunkhouse. By midweek, exhaustion set in, and this is where camp life reveals just how little control these men had over their own bodies, even off the clock. Bunkhouses were frequently infested with bedbugs, alcohol was banned in most company camps to keep men sober and productive, and outfits enforced strict schedules dictating when men slept, ate, and bathed if bathing facilities existed at all. Wages were paid out irregularly, sometimes through employment agencies nicknamed sharks that took a cut before a man ever set foot in the woods. But this wasn't an accident of poor planning, it was a business model, because a workforce with no savings, no union hall, and no say in camp conditions was a workforce that couldn't easily walk away. Therefore, the danger of the job itself was only half the story. The other half was a system built to keep men too broke and too isolated to demand anything better. Day 5. What 1 in 150 actually meant. This is the number from the opening, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Historian Andrew Mason Prouty's research, published in his study More Deadly Than War, found that during the early 20th century, roughly 1 in 150 loggers in Washington state died on the job annually, while nearly 1 in 5 suffered a serious injury every single year. That fatality rate meant a young man who started logging at 18 had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of never reaching 65. Falling trees, snapped cables, runaway logs on skid roads, and collapsing spar trees accounted for the bulk of it. But the companies running these camps weren't legally required to carry the kind of insurance or safety standards that even factories of the same era had to meet. So a death in the woods often meant a burial, a brief note in a company ledger, and a replacement hired within the week. Therefore, the industry didn't just tolerate this death rate. For years, it operated as if there were no cost to it at all. Day 6. When the company brought guns. By the later years of this era, loggers had started fighting back, and this is where the story turns from dangerous work into open violence. Frustrated by wage cuts and unsafe camps, workers across Washington began organizing with the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, and in 1916, members traveling from Seattle to support striking shingle workers in Everett were met at the dock by roughly 200 armed men deputized by a sheriff aligned with the mill owners. Gunfire broke out within minutes, killing at least 5 IWW members and 2 deputies in what is remembered as the bloodiest labor confrontation in Pacific Northwest history. A clash historians still debate the full details of, since surviving accounts from strikers and from local authorities disagree sharply on who fired first. Here is the detail that rarely makes it into the story. Later investigation showed both deputies who died were shot in the back by their own side's crossfire, not by the strikers they had come to stop. But the message from the timber companies was unmistakable either way. Organizing for safer conditions could get you shot at, not just fired. Therefore, the danger of this job was never only about trees and gravity. For the men who tried to change it, the danger came from their own employers too. Day 7. The day the 10-hour day died. By 1917, with America at war and desperate for Sitka spruce to build fighter planes, tens of thousands of Pacific Northwest loggers walked off the job demanding an 8-hour day, better pay, and camps that were not crawling with bedbugs. Lumber barons refused for months, even as spruce shipments needed for the war effort collapsed to a fraction of what the military required. But with production nearly frozen, the US War Department stepped in, and by March of 1918, the 8-hour day was formally recognized across the Northwest lumber industry. It was not handed down out of generosity, as company statements claimed at the time, but won because thousands of exhausted men refused to keep working themselves into an early grave for free. So here's the last dab. The men who felled the biggest trees on the continent by hand did not just risk their lives to gravity, saw blades, and 200-foot falls. They risked them to an industry that saw a dead 18-year-old as a rounding error, and they had to fight, sometimes under gunfire, just to cut 2 hours off a 10-hour day. Next time you walk past a stack of 2x4s at a hardware store, remember that behind lumber that ordinary, there is a labor history that ordinary people paid for with their lives.